morning, July 25th, 1841. Mary got up early as always to help her mother make breakfast for the boarders and do other household chores. Then she changed into her Sunday clothes, told her fiancé that she was going to visit her aunt. Then she grabbed a straw hat and a parasol for shade on a sunny day, left the house, closed the door behind her, and was never again seen alive.
Welcome to Polk's America. I'm your host, Thomas Samuel. On this episode, a whodunit from the 1840s based largely on the Daniel Stashower book, The Beautiful Cigar Girl. Our presenter is John Holtzapple, the director of the President James K. Polk Home and Museum in Columbia, Tennessee. In John's presentation, The Fate of Mary Rogers, How a 19th Century Murder Mirrored Polk's America, he introduced the audience to Mary Rogers, as she and her mother had just arrived in the big city. Two of tens of thousands.
One of the Polk Home's interpretive focuses has always been westward expansion, the movement of people from east of the Appalachian Mountains, across the mountains, and the whole way to the Pacific Ocean. We often also talk about all the European immigrants coming into America in the early 1800s. But there's another migration pattern really important at that time that we don't discuss as much. And it's the movement of people from small towns and rural areas into the big East Coast cities. From 1800 to 1850, New York City's population grew from 60,000 people to 590,000 people. During the Panic of 1837, the financial situation compelled Phoebe Rogers and her daughter Mary to move from Lyme, Connecticut to New York City. And that's when a family acquaintance named John Anderson made a proposal that he thought would benefit them and himself. Noticing, as most men did, how attractive Mary was, Anderson proposed that she work behind the counter of his tobacco emporium. She wouldn't have to know anything about tobacco. He'd be there to answer questions. All she'd have to do is smile at the customers, hand over the products, basically be there and be beautiful.
John Anderson ran a tobacco emporium in Manhattan, frequented by New York's literary and journalistic elite, and his clientele became infatuated with the young Mary Rogers.
The idea of a young woman, in this case a teenager, selling what was seen as a men's product was certainly caused a stir at that time. It was really controversial. Some saw it as refreshing, others saw it as disgraceful, but the beautiful cigar girl became the talk of New York City. More and more customers came to Anderson's, and others would linger in the vicinity, hoping to catch a glimpse of Mary Rogers, the city's latest celebrity. And if you're kind of skeptical about the idea of a store clerk becoming so famous so soon, remember what I mentioned about this being a sort of hangout for newspapermen. It was the journalists who really called attention, talked about her beauty and her poise, and described her as somewhat mysterious and enigmatic. It was only because of her celebrity that it was a news story when one time she didn't show up to work. And then she didn't show up the next day. And before you know it, newspapers were speculating all sorts of things, that she had run off with a client from the tobacco shop, or that she had committed suicide. All these wild stories. And then a few days later, she showed up again saying that she'd been visiting a friend in Brooklyn and was aghast about all this fuss.
Mary Rogers was made a local celebrity by the New York media, and those journalists showed themselves willing to make up a story in Mary's absence. While Mary was annoyed with the fuss, she probably couldn't imagine what that same press would say upon her death. But to quote director Holtzapple, more about that later. And though it had made her a celebrity, Mary didn't work at John Anderson's tobacco emporium for very much longer. In fact, her mother received a sum of money from a son who'd been away at sea, and with that money, she opened a boarding house.
Operating a boarding house, which usually had 4 or 5 residents, meant a lot of cooking and cleaning for Phoebe and Mary. For Phoebe, it meant some financial stability. For Mary, the boarding house, like the cigar store, meant meeting a lot of people, especially a lot of men, who would come and go and would lavish a lot of attention on her. And that meant a challenge for future police investigators looking for men who might have been romantically interested in Mary Rogers.
And here's where the story gets interesting. 3 different boarders would become suspects in Mary's murder. All 3 of them would endure media and police scrutiny. Director Holtzapple introduced them.
One was a William Kykuk, I think that's how the name was pronounced. He was a sailor who stayed at the Rogers boarding house shortly after it opened. He wasn't there for long, but the time he was there, he definitely showed an interest in Mary. Even after he left, for several months, he continued to visit regularly. In fact, sure enough, he later would visit her again at a very inopportune time. A few years later, in 1840, Albert Cromlin, a clerk, probably a law clerk, moved into the boarding house. He was very well-mannered, to the point of seeming maybe a bit too formal. He was well-spoken, financially secure, and he was immediately attracted to Mary and saw himself as a suitor for her affections. Mary initially encouraged his advances, at least until Daniel Payne moved into the house in 1841. Payne was a cork cutter. In other words, he made stoppers for bottles for medicinal products such as laudanum, as well as bottles of liquor. Payne himself was a heavy user of the latter product, and by the end of this story, of laudanum too. Cromlin described Payne as dissipated, but Payne was friendly, outgoing, fun-loving, and he made Cromlin look stuffy in comparison. Payne also showed interest in Mary. 2 suitors in the same boarding house at the same time, but you could probably guess which one attracted Mary's favor. Pretty soon, Mary and Daniel Payne were seen in public laughing, holding hands, looking like a couple, and it really caused tension in the boarding house. Things went from frosty to hostile in June of 1841 when Albert Cromlin pretty much tried to lecture Daniel Payne on gentlemanly behavior. Payne pretty much laughed that off. Cromlin packed his bags and left. Mary Rogers and Daniel Payne grew even closer, and soon Payne was spreading the word that they were engaged.
It was a Sunday morning in late July, 1841. Mary told Daniel Payne she was going to visit an aunt on the other side of the big city. According to his testimony, Payne spent the day waiting for her to return at a local tavern, and when she did not arrive, he assumed she had stayed with her aunt and that she would return the following morning. Mary never came home.
Unlike Mary's frantic mother, Daniel Payne wasn't worried when Mary didn't arrive home on Monday morning. But in the afternoon, he made the trip to the aunt's house and was surprised to learn, as was later verified, the aunt and her family weren't even home that Sunday. Now worried, on his way back to the boarding house, Daniel Payne stopped at a newspaper office to get a missing persons ad. He described Mary's appearance, how she was dressed, gave the boarding house address for responses, but didn't give her name. It might seem odd that he went to a newspaper rather than the police, but there was a time New York City had over 10 newspapers, and they really blanketed the city, and that could not be said for the police department. The city then had no centralized, trained, professional police force. There were fewer than 200 law enforcement officers in a city with over 320,000 residents. Daniel Payne never received any helpful responses from his ad, but Albert Cromlin, now living elsewhere, did see the ad, recognized the address, figured out that it was Mary that was missing, and it was Albert Cromlin who first went to the police department because he wanted them to go to places where he didn't intend to visit. Such was his attitude of Daniel Payne and his effect, or what he thought Daniel Payne's effect would be on Mary, that he asked for the police to look at houses of prostitution.
Just to recap, Mary Rogers' fiancé, Daniel Payne, was one of the last to see her alive, and he placed a missing person ad in the newspaper. This ad was seen by Mary's former suitor, Albert Cromlin, who then went to the police believing that Payne's influence may have led Mary down a dark path. And with the police searching in the shadowy corners of New York City, Cromlin conducted his own investigation in more respectable locations.
Albert Cromlin went to Elysian Fields looking for Mary Rogers. There was a big park area right across the Hudson River from New York City, and it's where a lot of New Yorkers went on weekends for recreation. And Cromlin, from the description of the ad, knew that Mary was well-dressed, a white dress, a parasol. Maybe she was going to a place like Elysian Fields where a lot of other stylish New Yorkers would have been. And that's why he was there on Wednesday, the Wednesday following Mary's disappearance, making inquiries when he noticed a lot of commotion along the river's edge.
At this point, I would just like to give a warning. The next section of the podcast contains somewhat graphic descriptions of both physical and sexual violence. If you have younger listeners, especially, you might want to skip ahead to the next section.
He went over toward the group and found out that two men had seen a body floating in the river and had gotten in a rowboat and dragged the body ashore. It was a woman's body. The face had been battered beyond recognition, but Cromlin thought he recognized the dress. He then shocked the assembled crowd by grabbing one of the arms and pulling down the sleeve. And because of a distinctive pattern of arm hair, Cromlin identified the body as Mary Rogers. The autopsy performed by a New Jersey coroner produced a report with many disturbing details. Patterns of blood coagulation indicated that the victim did not drown and that she had been alive when her face was pummeled. There are bruises around her neck and a thin band of muslin sort of embedded in her neck, tied tightly with a sailor's knot. She had apparently been strangled. There were deep marks on her wrists, perhaps rope marks, as if her hands had been tied up. There's another band of muslin around her midsection, perhaps to tie her somewhere, then looking more like a hitch, as if to drag a body. And indeed, abrasions of the body indicated that it had been dragged, perhaps after death. Examination of the clothing revealed that the strips of fabric that had bound and choked her had been torn from her own undergarment. That discovery led to another fear that was confirmed when the coroner found severe bruising in her private area. The conclusion from the coroner: Mary Rogers had been tied down, beaten, horribly violated by more than 2 or 3 persons, and killed.
In 1842, Edgar Allan Poe published The Mystery of Marie Roget, in which the author fictionalizes the murder of Mary Rogers and transports the crime from New York City to the streets of Paris. There his character, C. Auguste Dupin, pardon my French, tries to solve the crime. In Poe's fictional Paris, the discovery of the Roget body causes a media frenzy. He writes, the atrocity of this murder, the youth and beauty of the victim, and above all, her previous notoriety, conspired to produce intense excitement in the minds of the sensitive Parisians. I can call to mind no similar occurrence producing so general and so intense an effect.
The autopsy was sufficiently shocking that it didn't need to be sensationalized to attract newspaper readers, but it was. But where the papers really went wrong was latching onto all sorts of theories of what happened and just trumpeting those theories in headlines without regard to any evidence, often in conflict with existing evidence. Maybe genuine theories, or maybe theories just so they could sell papers with a different headline. And they started pinpointing or shining a very glaring light on all those people, all those acquaintances around Mary Rogers.
Though neither man had been arrested or accused by the police, Daniel Payne was suspected by journalists of fabricating the story of Mary's disappearance, and Albert Cromlin came under fire when a newspaper discovered Mary had visited him days before her murder. Newspapers remained unconvinced by the two men's alibis and offered their own alternative storylines to hungry readers. But the press wasn't the only group jumping to conclusions.
Now, at least in the preceding cases, the police seemed to be conducting a fair investigation. But there were times when the police themselves jumped to conclusions. Some of you might have noticed when I mentioned the autopsy, I said that the muslin strip around Mary Rogers' neck had been tied with a sailor's knot. The police certainly noticed that and found out about William Kycook, the man who lived at the boarding house several years earlier. They learned that his ship was in port in New York City at the time, and they learned that just a few weeks before her disappearance, William Kycook had visited Mary at the boarding house. They also found out that on the same day that her body was discovered, he had gone back to his ship. He was staying at the ship in a state of considerable agitation. Now, all of those are details that certainly justify a police interview. But do they really justify having a team of constables go on board the ship at nighttime, drag Kycook from his bunk, put him in shackles, haul him to the prison, and confine him for 3 days until finally confirming his very detailed alibi for July 25th? He had spent the morning with his sister in New York, then spent the afternoon, or part of the afternoon, swimming with friends in the river, and spent the rest of the day with a girl he knew, a girl who soon the whole city knew was a prostitute. So obviously he was exonerated, but to considerable embarrassment for himself as that story spread throughout the newspapers. And newspapers had a field day with the ineptitude of the police for not only not nabbing the wrong man, but here you have police constantly under fire for failure to respond to vice crimes, using a prostitute as a corroborating witness rather than arresting her.
As the investigations went on, the newspapers and the police targeted neighbors and acquaintances of Mary Rogers. An engraver who lived nearby named Joseph Morse was accused after his wife went to the police to report spousal abuse. Morse was a violent philanderer who had been seen with a young girl on the night of Mary's murder. The police and the papers thought they had their man.
Newspapers, all with their own theories, did try to make the circumstances fit into their narratives, but none of the papers seemed to doubt Morse's guilt. In fact, they turned their attention to digging up as much dirt as they could find from Joseph Morse's past and demanding his execution. Unlike Kycook, Morse could not confidently say that he wasn't with Mary Rogers that day. He said he met a young woman and had persuaded her to spend the afternoon with him. He'd seen her before, but he couldn't quite place her, and he didn't know her name and never asked her name. They went to Staten Island. By turning back his watch, he made sure that they missed the last ferry off the island and had to spend the night at a hotel. But his ultimate plan was thwarted when the young woman insisted that they had separate rooms at the inn, and both of them went their separate ways the next morning. He did insist, though, on why he felt pretty sure that it wasn't Mary Rogers. The woman was wearing a black dress, and all accounts of Mary Rogers was that she was in a white dress. Morse spent over a week in a cell overlooking the prison's gallows courtyard before a group of 4 witnesses came forward to say that they had seen Morse with a woman in a black dress that Sunday afternoon, and that they had recognized the woman as the daughter of a prominent judge in town. So the police tracked down the woman, who turned out to be a very scared and nervous 16-year-old girl, who in her interview pretty much confirmed everything that Joseph Morse had said. Though she did add a few details. Yes, they had been in separate rooms at the inn, but he had failed to mention that he had beaten down her hotel room door in the middle of the night, had tried to force himself upon her. She had fought him off before anything else happened. She wanted to put the whole episode behind her and had no wish to press charges for attempted rape.
At this point in the story, the trail had gone cold. The police had wrongfully arrested and mistreated suspects. The papers proved willing to smear and accuse anyone with a connection to the case. But the mystery remained. Who killed Mary Rogers?
It was in September. Remember, the crime was in late July. In September, Frederica Moss, a widowed tavern keeper in Weehawken, New Jersey, just north of Hoboken, told her local police that her sons, while looking for sassafras in the surrounding woods, had found a thicket in which they found a woman's handkerchief, scarf, parasol, and a cloth fragment from a white dress. Between the thicket and the river, a distance away, the undergrowth had been flattened, and there were furrows in the dirt as if something had been dragged to the river. In fact, parts of 2 fences had even been taken down. When Mrs. Moss saw the clothing, or the articles, the fashion articles, she right away said that she remembered the woman. It was a well-dressed young woman accompanied by a swarthy man. His description didn't match that of any of the suspects so far in the Rogers case. They did spend time in the tavern. The man ordered some liquor. The woman asked for just lemonade, and then they left. That night, same night they were there, Mrs. Law said that she had stepped outside and suddenly heard a scream and a call for help. But she thought it came from her son, who was chasing a bull off the property, and she was worried that her son had been gored. After surveying the thicket and the clothing, the police decided that this probably indeed was the murder site, and most of the newspapers agreed. But there were reasons to doubt this story. All of the details, everything there had been something that was mentioned in the newspaper. Mary was wearing a white dress. She was carrying a parasol that had never been found. So if you wanted to recreate or fake a crime scene, all of the details were there in the newspaper. Now, why would anyone fake a crime scene? Well, there was a big reward for finding information on the assailant of Mary Rogers. And also, what came next was very suggestive. Up until this time, Mrs. Loss's tavern had been moderately successful on nice weekends. After this, it was packed every day as flocks of New Yorkers crossed the river to see the murder thicket. In fact, Mrs. Loss's 2 sons even offered guided tours of the site for a hefty fee.
Just as the newspapers had capitalized on the grisly murder of a young woman, just as Edgar Allan Poe would later do in The Mystery of Marie Roget, just as we are doing now, the tavern keeper and her sons shamelessly sold the story of Mary's murder to willing consumers.
Now, on one trip to the thicket, visitors were surprised to find a man's hat and a broken vial of laudanum. Mrs. Loss recognized the hat as belonging to a customer who earlier that day had been at the tavern drinking for hours and drunkenly claiming that he was Mary Rogers' fiancé. Apparently, Daniel Payne was taking a tour of the sites associated with Mary's death. His hat was found in the murder thicket, and his dead body was found at Elysian Fields, near where Mary's body had been pulled ashore. Police were uncertain whether Payne was trying to kill himself or merely seeking solace when he consumed excessive amounts of alcohol and laudanum. According to newspapers, though, it was obviously suicide, especially when they found a pencil-written note in his pocket saying, "To the world, here I am on the spot. God forgive me for my misfortune and my misspent time." Of course, the newspapers ran that story like crazy. For many, the message was that of a regretful, grieving lover, and it gave Payne some stature. For a man who'd been portrayed in the newspapers as a lousy fiancé and a possible murderer. For others, though, the note seemed like a confession from a guilt-ridden man who had killed his fiancée, perhaps unintentionally, while in a drug or alcohol-fueled rage.
Mr. Holtzapple outlined a final theory championed by the New York papers in 1841, that Mary Rogers had actually died of a failed abortion in the back of Frederica Loss's tavern. Though this theory had little truth to back it up, it spread, leading to a crackdown on illegal abortions in New York. In fact, the murder of Mary Rogers was used by many social movements to effect change, from women's rights to temperance to police and prison reform. Many issues were mirrored in the story of Mary Rogers' death.
Because there were so many unanswered questions in the Mary Rogers case, the public could fill in the details. Whatever you feared most in society could have played a role in Mary Rogers' death. It was like the Mary Rogers case spoke to all these reform movements, and so many different movements were able to somehow connect their story to their cause. In The Mystery of Marie Roget, Edgar Allan Poe compared the fate of the unhappy Mary Cecilia Rogers to the remarkable similar fate of Marie Roget. Well, thanks in part to Poe, it was the fate of Mary Rogers and all others surrounding her to become characters in an enduring mystery story, one that was told over in more and more novels and plays, became part of New York City lore. They also became celebrities, symbols, case studies, and object lessons. How they might have felt about this cause, all these causes they were associated with, we'll never know. Because before all that, they were real people dealing with real hardships. Their lives are changing as much as the country is changing. And right at the center of all of that, a quiet young woman, 21 years old, a keeper of secrets, according to the newspapers, who got up on a Sunday morning, did her chores, changed into her good clothes, went out from her mother's house into the big growing city, and closed the door behind her.
This has been Polk's America, a podcast produced by the President James K. Polk Home and Museum in Columbia, Tennessee. For more information, visit jameskpolk.com. I'm your host, Thomas Samuel. Thanks for listening.